President Trump says he would look to impose tariffs of between 60 and 100% on China.
You're talking about 60% tariffs on Chinese goods. Is that in the cards?
No, I would say maybe it's going to be more than that.
Donald Trump has stated that if elected, he would consider implementing a massive 60% tariff on all Chinese imports. That's more than 5 times the current tax on Chinese imports. So I wanted to know what the economic ramifications of this proposed tariff would be. How would it affect China as a whole? How would it affect the United States as a whole? And most importantly, how would it affect your and my wallets? Just to be clear, this video is not about whether Trump should or should not be president, or if he was a good person or not, or if he was a good president or not. It's simply focused on what's most likely to happen if this specific policy is implemented. Now, if you don't know what a tariff is, let me get you up to speed. A tariff is a tax that countries put on foreign goods coming in from other countries so that domestic producers can have an easier time selling their products. So say you own a shoe store and you want to buy sneakers from a factory in another country. If the government decides to place a tariff on imported shoes, it means you'll have to pay extra money for those tennis shoes when they arrive. So if the shoes originally cost $50 per pair and there's a 20% tariff, you'll end up paying $60 per pair instead. This extra cost oftentimes gets passed on to customers, making imported shoes more expensive to buy in the store. The idea is to make local products more attractive financially by making foreign goods pricier, because if you could buy local shoes for $55 instead of the $60 tariff shoes, you would, and thus local production is encouraged and foreign imports are discouraged. So let's start with answering the first question. How would a 60% Trump tariff on China affect China's economy? According to the investment bank UBS, a 60% tariff on imported Chinese goods would drastically reduce China's GDP growth by 2.5 percentage points in the first year after it's implemented. For perspective, that's more than half the percentage drop the Great Recession had on the US economy, where we saw GDP fall by 4.3%. But this GDP number doesn't truly show the impact of these tariffs. According to the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, Trump's proposed 60% tariffs on China could reduce Chinese imports to the United States by as much as 85% as Americans buy from other Asian manufacturers or Latin American ones. This massive drop in exports, along with China's domestic population being unwilling to consume at the same levels as American consumers, will almost certainly put China into a deep recession in the short term. Although in the long run, Chinese companies could pivot to selling their goods to European, African, or Pacific countries, the reality is that this will take time and many businesses in China will go bankrupt without government intervention. So we know that Trump's tariffs would not be good for the Chinese economy. But how would it affect the US economy? To understand this, we need to look back at some history. Let's put politics aside here because Joe Biden kept the tariffs Trump implemented. In other words, I'm not going to take political potshots at anybody right now. I'm just trying to talk about economics. Trump's first trade war was not economically beneficial to the United States. Strategically / politically, yeah, you could totally argue that it had some merits in reducing dependency on China. But the trade war was billed as a way to boost US manufacturing and reduce the trade imbalance, and neither really occurred. American consumers almost exclusively paid the tariffs the US imposed on nearly $380 billion worth of imports. Now, if you don't believe me, that's totally okay. Let's look at the tariffs implemented on washing machines during Trump's presidency. Essentially, Whirlpool, an American washing machine company, went to the Trump administration saying that foreign washing machine manufacturers were cornering the American washing machine market with cheaper models that really threatened domestic manufacturers, aka them. So Trump slapped tariffs ranging from 20% to 50% on imported washers to protect Whirlpool's American manufacturing. Since consumers oftentimes shop for a new washer and dryer at the same time, and their costs have traditionally been similar, rather than raise prices by 20% on washers and make them more expensive than dryers, these companies raised both washer and dryer prices by 11.5% each. But as Samsung and LG raised prices to maintain their profit margins, Whirlpool increased prices too, largely just because they could. There aren't a lot of upstart domestic producers of laundry equipment that could undercut Whirlpool on price after all, so Whirlpool just raised their prices. Overall, tariffs drove up the price of washing machines by about $86 per unit. In total, American consumers shelled out an extra $1.5 billion because of these tariffs, and that's after you subtract the $82 million in revenue from the tariffs. So even though the tariff created 1,800 new jobs, the effective price tag of each job was about $817,000. And the high cost of these new jobs is not the only negative externality. When the US imposed tariffs on other products like steel, aluminum, solar panels, and other goods from China, China retaliated, obviously, with tariffs on US exports. And China stopped purchasing agricultural products from the United States almost entirely, which really hurt American farmers. According to the Federal Reserve, quote, the impact from the traditional import protection channel is completely offset in the short run by reduced competitiveness from retaliation and higher costs in downstream industries, end quote. So essentially, in regular people words, the tariffs didn't create an overall benefit because the benefits for some products, say washing machines, was outweighed by the additional cost for other products, say soybeans. But those are relatively small tariffs, right? Going from 3% to 12%? What if the United States actually implemented the 60% tariffs that Donald Trump has proposed? Well, we can actually look back 200 years in US history for an answer here. In 1807, the United States was caught in the crossfire of the Napoleonic Wars between France and Great Britain. The United States wanted to be treated as a neutral party in the conflict, but that wasn't really happening. So, President Thomas Jefferson imposed an outright embargo on all trade. This is essentially an infinity % tariff. The idea was to use the lack of trade to force both France and Britain to treat the US neutrally. As trade halted under the embargo, prices of what would have been exports cratered, and the prices of what would have been imports skyrocketed. Historical estimates suggest that the economy shrank by 5% as a result of the embargo, and nobody was happy. Congress ultimately repealed the embargo after only 15 months. Apparently, politicians hadn't really learned their lesson because 20 years later, Congress enacted the Tariff Act of 1828. The law imposed up to 62% tariffs on raw materials. It was nicknamed the Bill of Abominations and had a lot of unintended political and economic consequences, but that's outside the scope of this video. Once the negative economic impacts were clear, Congress began lowering tariffs and the average tariff gradually fell from the high of 62% to under 20%. Obviously, a lot has changed in the last 200 years since these tariffs were enacted. Today, the US economy is significantly more interconnected with economies around the globe. In 2022, the United States imported $537 billion worth of goods from China. Now, assuming the Federal Reserve holds the interest rate constant and demand remains the same, which is unlikely, but we'll talk about that in a second, a 60% tariff on all imports from China would raise taxes by more than $320 billion to US citizens. But this $320 billion revenue number would not actually ever be reached because a 60% tariff is not designed to raise tax revenue. It's designed to prohibit trade. Since a tariff of this caliber is expected to reduce trade by as much as 85%, we would see tariff revenue stay relatively the same because of this fall in overall imports. And in the absolute best case scenario, we would see revenue rise by a couple of $1 billion each year, but most likely it'll stay around the $50 billion mark that it is today. Trump's 60% tariff would not work as intended to bring jobs back to the United States. Yes, a 60% tariff would make it realistically almost impossible to affordably buy anything from China. However, American companies outsource to China because of the low cost and solid quality that the factories there are able to output. With China off limits, they will want to still keep these competitive advantages, so most companies will just pivot to another low-cost country like India, Thailand, or Mexico. They will not bring lots of jobs back to the United States. But in the meantime, while businesses adjust their supply chains, US consumers will either not be able to buy certain products because companies won't sell them with the tariffs on them, or consumers will have to pay a lot more than they're used to for these goods. This leads to the last and most important question of how will Trump's 60% tariffs affect our wallets? Well, based on the impacts of Trump's first tariff trade war, we know that on average, even with companies moving around their supply chains to reduce the cost of tariffs, American consumers paid $200 more per year because of these tariffs. Now, Joe Biden added onto these tariffs with more targeted tariffs, but regardless of how targeted they were, these tariffs continue to raise prices for American consumers by almost $400 per year. If Trump's 6% tariffs were implemented, we would see these numbers quadruple to be well over $1,600 a person per year. Now, this is after calculating the fact that companies would try to move their manufacturing to other locations. Donald Trump's 60% tariff would work, but only in as far as working is defined as ending trade with China. If the goal is to prevent dependence on China for industries that are necessary for our national security, yes, this would force companies to source from countries that are friendlier to the United States. But a 60% tariff would not increase American standard of living, and the average American would have to pay more money to maintain their current lifestyle. Now, does Trump's 60% tariff policy being economically fallacious mean that you shouldn't vote for him? No, not necessarily. He could have other policies that are really good. But in order to decide which candidate's economic policies are best, you need to understand them both. So if you want to see that head-to-head comparison of Kamala Harris's economic agenda against Donald Trump's economic agenda, be sure to hit that subscribe button because I'll be making that video in the next couple of weeks. And if you feel like I missed anything, let me know in the comments below. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys next time.